Well, I'm very excited to have our second keynote address. Eric Liu is the co-founder and CEO of Citizen University, which works to build a culture of powerful and responsible citizenship in the United States. He is also the founding director of the Aspen Institute's Citizenship and American Identity program. He's the author of numerous acclaimed books, including most recently, You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen and Become America's Civic Sermons on Love, Responsibility, and Democracy, a New York Times and new and notable book. We are so excited to welcome to the stage Eric Liu. Thanks, Eric.
Governor, thank you so much. I want to thank you and Governor Lee, First Ladies of both states, just for making this gathering possible and bringing us together here. And I'm just so thrilled that the whole Disagree Better project has taken on this life, not just in terms of numbers of convenings around the country, but the way in which people are connecting with one another, connecting dots, making 1 + 1 = 3 in different projects in different ways. And it's a thrilling thing in this moment. I wanted to spend some time today to talk about this moment and where we are as a people, as a society. And I had some thoughts previously framed for my remarks today, and just listening to this morning's sessions, I was telling David I'm calling an audible and have a slightly different set of things that I want to name here and bring into the room because I think this initiative is now so far along, both in its own life but also in the impact it's already having around the country, that I want to make sure that we bring in some ideas and some topics that maybe haven't been named quite so fully today yet. But let me just start by giving you a little bit of context about myself and this work. So I lead this organization, nonprofit called Citizen University. We're based in Seattle, but we work all around the United States. And our work is about fostering a culture of powerful, responsible citizenship. And I want to emphasize culture here. Everything we've been talking about here, even though we have governors in the room and others who work in policy and politics, is not to be legislated. You're not going to do a law to disagree better. You might get public funding for something like the American Exchange Project or other things, but this is not fundamentally about policy and legislation. This is fundamentally about culture, about the norms, narratives, habits, values, mindsets, and heart sets that we bring every day to the ways that we choose to answer a very simple American question, which is this: how shall we live together? In American life, you can't take that for granted. We're trying to do something that is remarkable, audacious, and has not yet been done in human history, and that is to create the planet's first mass, multiracial democratic republic that lasts. Hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened where you get this scale of diversity, this scale of humanity, and people don't eventually start killing each other. And so the audacity of this endeavor that we're doing is worth naming. And in this moment that we're gathering here, this moment is one of these moments that tests whether this experiment actually can work. Governor Lee and I were talking before we got started about the ways in which, when you remember the origins of this country, the origin story that did not include many of us who are in this room, did not contemplate that 240 some years down the road, governors would come together and have an initiative like this, and that the son of Chinese immigrants would be among the folks speaking here. That even back in those times, in fact, particularly in those times, people understood the fragility of this enterprise. That the arguments out of which this country was birthed were not just incidental, were not things to try to patch over and resolve, but were the very life force of this country. And so when I talk about the ways in which Citizen University emphasizes culture, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that we have got to foster a culture of argument. America is an argument, properly understood. Even though we're toxically polarized and everything we've heard today says we want to learn how to humanize each other and make things less toxic, we must not forget that the point here actually is not necessarily to find common ground. We may not find common ground. A whole host of issues. The point here is not to avoid argument, it is to have less stupid arguments. And it is to remember that America actually is an argument, and that when I say that, I don't just mean that we're different and we're diverse and we're going to be at odds with each other in different ways. What I mean is that from the very beginning, the idea of America was a tension waiting to explode into a conflict. We are an argument between liberty and equality. And you might think, well, I love those words. I love those ideas. That's like mom and apple pie. No, liberty, when you overemphasize that, everybody get and do whatever the heck they want, necessarily infringes upon our desire for equal justice and equal opportunity. But if you overemphasize equality and all you want to do is level things and make things the same for folks, you're necessarily going to infringe on people's liberty. These things are in tension from the get-go. The tension between a strong national government and local control. The tension between the pluribus and the unum in our national motto. The tension between a colorblind and a color-conscious approach to law and the Constitution. The Constitution itself, as the governor and I were talking about. Federalist and anti-federalist ideas of how we're supposed to actually be in the work of self-government. America is an argument. And so getting comfortable in the first place with argument, with a culture of argument, is one of the most important things we can do. And so to say disagree better is not only to say be more civil, be more nice, be more kind, but it's also to say be more alive, human, open about the very requirement that we learn how to argue with each other. And to recognize it is that by actually dealing with each other in that way, that we begin to fulfill the promise of what this country can be. And there are three things in particular that I want to name here about what this culture of constructive argument can actually look like. The first is one that we haven't actually named today: power. Power. There are a lot of folks gathered here today in the room who are connected with Starts With Us and now the Builders Movement, which was catalyzed by Daniel Lubetzky. Some of you know and have heard of. Daniel Lubetzky is the very successful entrepreneur behind Kind Bars and the whole Kind franchise. Some of you have seen him on Shark Tank, and he's just a great, smart, attuned person who has decided to use some of his power, his wealth, his influence, his presence, not for self-aggrandizement, but actually to foster this same kind of culture of bridging divides, of humanizing each other across divides. And he's created this whole endeavor called the Builders Movement. And one of the slogans that he actually has given this movement that was in a TED Talk that he recently gave was the idea of us versus extremists, framing things in that narrative. Just as Governor Cox was describing earlier, that there are, on both sides of the political divide right now, incentives that reward extremism, incentives that reward performative extremism, that reward kind of a flattening of three-dimensional humans into two-dimensional caricatures. And that movements like the Builders Movement are trying to address that. But one of the things that I think is really important in an effort like that, and really important in an effort like Disagree Better, is not only to say that it's us against extremists, but actually for us candidly, honestly, and with an open heart as well as an open mind to ask, why are people being drawn to extremes in the first place? What's appealing to people about going hard left or going hard right now? Right now. And one of the things that is driving people that way is the fact that we do live in an age of severe inequality. Inequality of power, inequality of voice, inequality of presence, inequality of wealth, yes? And when you get in an age like this, and you can blame the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, for how we got here over the last 40, 50 years, but there's no question that everybody feels it in their bones, this sense of scarcity, this sense of, I'm not going to be the sucker who turns the other cheek. I'm not going to be the sucker who gives ground to this other person, because it's every man for himself right now. This is a zero-sum world. And when you live in a society where wealth, voice, power, presence concentrate, where those who have get more, as Scripture predicted, where the rich get richer, the influential on Instagram get more influential as influencers, where power compounds in these ways, our politics will become more raw. Our politics will become more angry. our politics will go to extremes, and arguments will become toxic and dehumanizing. And we can't resolve that simply by saying, be nicer to each other, more civility, more kindness. We've got to be honest about the fact that things have split apart in this way, and ask ourselves, again, honestly, how do we remedy this? Now, remedying that inequity, that imbalance in power, might sound like, oh, here's a Seattle guy from the left giving a good left-wing speech here. It's not. There are small c conservative ideas about how to make sure the game isn't rigged to benefit the already privileged. A lot of small c conservatism about limiting the role of the state is oriented toward giving people more opportunity, not just those who inherited it. There are progressive arguments for the same. But reckoning with power is one of the things that we've got to be able to do as grown-ups if we want to spread this movement beyond simply the well-intentioned and the well-meaning. And to be able to do that in the way that Governor Cox and Governor Lee have, by being straight with folks. We're going to disagree on stuff. Governor Cox and I were at a conference together a few weeks ago, and I happened to watch him in interaction as some of his own constituents. This was not in Utah, but some of his constituents were at this conference, and they came up to him who were disagreeing sharply with him on some policies and legislation that were being advanced in the state of Utah. And he looked at them, and he did not harden. I saw in his eyes, he did not harden and say, okay, suit up. Here's people coming at me on this issue. And I'm just going to kind of glaze over and kind of, and then pretend that I got to turn to this next guy. He locked in on them, and he locked in to humanize. And he did what we were hearing on the panel here. He heard them so that he might be heard. But he didn't even take his turn after he heard them. He didn't say, well, let me explain to you why we're doing this policy. He simply heard them, and he humanized them. And he did so recognizing that there was inherently a power imbalance between him, the governor of the state, and they, constituents who feel, as members in this case of the LGBT community, that their identities, that their very being was being threatened by some of these proposals and these policies. And he didn't get into it on the specifics of that, but he humanized them, and he humanized his own relative power. And he made space, recognizing that that's a way to actually engage people. So power is one thing that we've got to reckon with. The second thing, though, that we've got to reckon with that connects right to that I really want to name here in the work we're doing, is another P word, and that word is pain. People are hurting right now. People are grieving right now. You think about what's been going on in our society, and you can pick your kind of starting point over the last 4 years, 3-4 years since COVID, over the last same number period of years since George Floyd, over the last 15-20 years as our economy, Tennessee accepted, Tennessee's booming, but as our economy in this society has gotten more grinding, more cruel, putting more people in more precarious situations, trying to scrape together gigs to make ends meet. Pick your starting point. There are all these reasons right now where people aren't just angry, aren't just disappointed, aren't just disillusioned with American democracy and American life. They are in grief. They are in pain. And what happens to pain, whether it's 3 years old, 5 years old, 50 years old, or 245 years old? What happens to pain and grief that is unrequited, unnamed, unaddressed, unacknowledged? Just smushed down. It erupts. Eventually it will erupt. And it will erupt in the form of people acting out. Our politics today is a politics, left and right, of people acting out. People who have not been given the space, the permission, or the invitation to name the ways in which they're hurting. One of the programs we run at Citizen University is called Civic Saturday. And this is a program that is essentially a civic equivalent to a faith gathering. It's not church, it's not synagogue or mosque, but on purpose it has the arc and the flow and the feel of a gathering like that, where you will sit down next to a stranger and be invited to ask and speak to a question that goes right past small talk, not, how are the Titans doing, or, what's going on at Utah State or whatever, but who have you failed lately? What's broken in your heart right now? What are you scared of in your community? And from those kinds of non-small talk questions, people are invited to rise and sing together. And how often do we get to do that? To actually vocalize together the miracle of our being together in a civic sense. There are readings of texts that you might think of as civic scripture drawn from all different parts of the American tradition. Someone will give a civic sermon to try to help make sense of these times. And again, not just the issues, but the undercurrents, the emotional undercurrents of pain, loss, fear, and grief. And at the end of that, people will sit in circles and talk about how do we convert that provocation, that inspiration, into some sense of responsibility taking. I'm so moved. I was talking to some of our friends from BYU and Utah State about one of the people who shaped me a great deal, actually. And Governor, we've not talked about this, a guy named C. Terry Warner, who was a longtime professor at BYU, mentor to many actually in this room, to Mitt Romney, among others, professor of organizational behavior and psychology. And he wrote a landmark book 20-some years ago called Bonds That Make Us Free, in which he describes this cycle that happens at every fractal scale of human behavior, a cycle he calls accuse to excuse. I accuse you in order to excuse me, right? Let's put politics and everything aside. This happens, at home. You come home and your partner, your spouse, you see, oh my gosh, dirty dishes in the sink. You're like, hey, why didn't you do the dishes? I've been working all day. Why don't you do the dishes? And that partner's response automatically is not to say, well, here's why I didn't do the dishes. Immediately, reflexively, it's, well, why didn't you take out the trash? Accuse to excuse. And C. Terry Warner in this book, Bonds That Make Us Free, talks about how at the household level, at the political level, at the community level, at the national level of Republicans and Democrats, my gosh, what we're seeing right now in the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, accuse to excuse on steroids, over and over and over again. And this is a collusive cycle, a cycle of collusion in which you actually find a certain pleasure in just ping-ponging back and forth the shirking of responsibility. The shirking of responsibility. And what C. Terry Warner said, and this was an idea that I think is shaped in part by his LDS faith, but it has nothing to do specifically with that particular faith tradition. It is, if anything, an American civic religious idea. It is a Tocquevillian idea. It is a Lincoln-type idea. This idea that the only way to break that cycle of accuse to excuse is to break it and to be the one, in fact, to take responsibility and say, you know what, my bad. I should have taken out the garbage. You know what? My bad. I should have understood how that piece of the Confederate battle flag offends you as the descendant of slaves. I should have understood that and thought about that twice. My bad. When we take responsibility in that way, we break this cycle of collusion that we use to avoid pain. And we make possible something else, which is the third and the final thing that I want to speak to. We make possible a different sense of purpose, of shared purpose. The point of disagreeing better is not only to keep each other from killing ourselves and killing each other. That's a pretty low bar, right? And even though we see in our popular culture right now movies like this movie Civil War and everything, we're normalizing the idea that maybe we will have disunion again. Maybe we will go there again. My gosh, here we are in the state of Tennessee, a border state, a state that chose to fight in the Union, a state that is itself a microcosm of the complexity of the United States. The three stars on the flag of Tennessee representing three parts of the state, each with its own culture, identity, place, history, traditions. All these things, all these ways. And that's true of every place we live. And yet in Tennessee, those three stars are on the same flag because there's a common purpose. There's a common idea. There's the common spirit of being the volunteer. A vol, yes. A vol or a lady vol, yes, in sports. But a volunteer. A spirit of, I show up. A spirit of, when I see the fire, I run toward the fire. a spirit of when there are cracks in the foundation of our union and a creeping sense of disunion, I lean in to be one of the people who builds, one of the people who opens up a different kind of conversation, one of the people who leads by example to create a new kind of culture. That's a narrative of common purpose that you can have in a state like Tennessee. That yes, you can say this is a bright red state that votes hard for Trump and so on and so forth, and yet it includes the breadth of humanity. Nashville isn't all that. Memphis isn't all that. And even parts of Franklin and parts of Athens and parts of you name your small town in the state aren't monolithic. They aren't monolithic because there is no human heart that is monolithic. And until we make space for that complexity of the human heart, we cannot find the possibility of common purpose. The way to find common purpose is not only for us to come together as we're doing here today and talking, but actually to come together and do what we're going to do after lunch here today. And that is to do stuff together in a spirit of service. And the final thing I want to tell you about is a program we have at Citizen University called the Civic Collaboratory. The Collaboratory is basically a mutual aid network of civic innovators from all different parts of the world and the work. And there's a national version of this, but there are now local versions of it in Atlanta, in Lexington, in Wichita, in Phoenix, in Charlotte, all over the country. And the reason why we call this thing a mutual aid club, it's not just a networking group, it's not just people coming together to talk about problems and issues, but it's folks taking turns circulating their power, recognizing what's broken in their communities. And so Governor Cox might come to one of these meetings and say, I've got this initiative called Disagree Better. Here's what's going on. Here's what's happening here in my time as chair of NGA. And the rest of the group, this room that is ideologically diverse, sectorally diverse, people from the veterans world, immigrant rights, civic education, business, faith, you name it, right and left, will lean in and listen to Governor Cox and not offer critique or commentary, but actually make hard commitments of help and investments of capital of every kind into their colleagues' project. And then what goes around comes around. Then it's your turn to be in rotation, making an ask and receiving help and commitments of help. And what this simple format, which is basically a lending circle writ large, what this simple format does is it reminds us that it's possible to find common purpose, not by sitting down and talking about how you and I are so different from each other, but by getting us together for you and I to work on a third thing together, to build that muscle of mutual aid, to build that muscle of reciprocity, to build that muscle of common purpose. Power, pain, and purpose. These are the things that we've got to hold in our hearts and to bring back home when we finish this day together. And at the end of the day, it is at home, whether literally in the kitchen, why didn't you take out the garbage? Or in your neighborhood, why is my neighborhood so segregated, so divided, so broken? Or in our country, how shall we live together? The answer is we're going to live like grown-up Americans. Thank you very much.